I'm Sylvia Stevenson, 40 years old, a career officer who built her life on discipline and service. For years, I carried my family's weight in silence, showing up when needed while quietly absorbing the jokes and the pity. But when my own mother laughed at a dinner table and said, "At your age, who would even want you?" I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed, underestimated, or humiliated by someone you gave everything to? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not the only one. Before I dive in, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand tall after being underestimated, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about boundaries, respect, and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might just surprise you. I'm looking at your story about a woman in the military who reveals her secret marriage to a Navy SEAL commander after years of her mother's cutting remarks. I'll write all 8 parts following your outline, each exactly 1,400 words, with the voiceover style you've requested. Let me begin. Growing up in my family meant learning to navigate the minefield of my mother's humor. She had this way of wrapping insults in laughter, making you wonder if you were being too sensitive when the words stung. At Sunday dinners, she'd hold court at the head of our worn oak table, fork in one hand, the other gesturing as she delivered her observations about life, about us, about me. "Sylvia's always been the serious one," she'd say, cutting into her pot roast with surgical precision. "All work, no play. That's why she's still single at 37. The comment would hang in the air like cigarette smoke, and someone would cough or reach for the salt, anything to fill the silence. I'd learned early that the best response was no response. Smile, nod, take another bite. Don't give her ammunition. But the comments accumulated like sediment, each one adding another layer to this version of me she'd constructed, the dedicated daughter who'd chosen career over love, duty over happiness. My siblings had heard it so often they'd started to believe it themselves. My brother Nicholas would pat my shoulder afterward, offering consolation I never asked for. "Don't let her get to you, Sylvia. You'll find someone when the time's right." As if I were some tragic figure in need of their pity. The truth was more complicated than their simple narrative allowed. My life wasn't empty, it was full, just not in ways they could see or understand. My days started before dawn with physical training, moved through briefings and operations, and often ended with classified work I couldn't discuss over family dinner. The military had given me purpose, structure, and a clear sense of who I was. It had also given me something else they didn't know about. But explaining that would have required them to see me differently, and change was never my family's strong suit. They preferred their established roles, mom as the sharp-tongued matriarch, dad as the quiet peacekeeper, my siblings as the successful ones with normal lives, marriages, kids, suburban houses with white picket fences. I was the anomaly, the one who'd chosen a different path and therefore deserved their gentle mockery. The comments evolved over time. In my 20s, they were about my dedication to training, how I never seemed interested in dating the nice boys from church. "Sylvia's married to the military," Mom would joke. In my 30s, they became more pointed, edged with concern that felt more like judgment. "At this rate, you'll end up alone with just your medals for company." What she didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that I wasn't waiting for life to happen to me. I was living it fully, just not in their line of sight. The deployments they saw as lonely adventures were experiences that shaped me, challenged me, connected me with people who understood dedication and sacrifice. The long hours they interpreted as workaholism were time spent in service to something larger than myself. And the space they assumed was empty? It wasn't empty at all. But explaining that would have meant revealing things I wasn't ready to share. So I let them maintain their fiction. I showed up to family dinners, absorbed their well-meaning concerns, and went home to a life they couldn't imagine. It was easier that way. Less complicated. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, someone who'd built a career on gathering intelligence, on seeing what others missed, and my own family had completely misread the situation. They saw absence where there was presence, loneliness where there was love, failure where there was simply privacy. Mom's comments were becoming more frequent, more pointed. At my cousin's wedding, she nudged me during the ceremony. "Look at that beautiful bride. 32 and still glowing." There's something to be said for not waiting too long. At my nephew's birthday party, she'd watched me help with the cleanup and sighed. "You're so good with kids, Sylvia. It's a shame you never had your own." Each comment was a small cut, but they were adding up. My patience, usually as disciplined as my morning workout routine, was wearing thin. I found myself avoiding family gatherings, making excuses about work commitments that were sometimes real, sometimes not. The space between us was growing, and I could see the concern in Dad's eyes, the way he'd try to bridge conversations, to smooth over Mom's sharper edges. But smoothing over wasn't what I needed. What I needed was for them to see me as I actually was, not as the character they'd cast me to play in their family drama. I was tired of being the cautionary tale, the example of what happened when you chose duty over domestic happiness. I was tired of their pity, their advice, their assumption that my life was somehow less than theirs because it looked different. The breaking point was building like pressure in a sealed container. Every family dinner, every casual comment, every sympathetic look was adding to it. I could feel something shifting inside me, a resolve hardening like steel under heat. I'd spent my career learning when to hold information close and when to deploy it for maximum effect. I was starting to realize that my family situation might benefit from a strategic disclosure. The next family dinner would be different. Not because I planned it that way, but because I'd finally reached my limit with being misunderstood. The woman who could navigate complex military operations with calm precision was about to apply those same skills to a much more personal battlefield. But first, I had to decide if they deserved the truth they'd been so quick to assume they already knew. The dinner started like all the others. Mom bustling around her kitchen, orchestrating the meal with military precision that would have impressed my commanding officers. Dad carving the roast with deliberate care. My siblings settling into their familiar seats, falling into the comfortable rhythm of family conversation. I took my usual place at the table, the chair that had been mine since childhood, positioned where I could see everyone but remained slightly apart from the main flow of discussion. It was a strategic position, I'd realized years ago, perfect for observation and easy extraction if needed. The conversation followed its predictable patterns. Work updates, neighborhood gossip, plans for upcoming holidays. I contributed where expected, asking about my nephew's soccer season, complimenting the new curtains Mom had hung in the dining room. Surface-level engagement that kept me present but protected. Then Mom served dessert, her famous apple pie that had won ribbons at the county fair 3 years running. She cut generous slices, her movements accompanied by commentary about each family member's dietary habits, their preferences, their lives. It was during this familiar ritual that she looked at me with that expression I'd come to know too well, part affection, part pity, all condescension. "Sylvia, honey, you should take home extra pie. You're too thin. All that military food and no one to cook for you." She shook her head, silver hair catching the overhead light. "I worry about you, living alone at your age." My brother's wife, Jessica, tried to redirect. "The pie is delicious, Mrs. Stevenson. Could I get the recipe?" But Mom was just getting started. She had an audience, and she never could resist playing to the crowd. "You know, I was talking to Martha Henderson at the grocery store yesterday. Her daughter just got engaged, she's 34, about to be married to that nice lawyer from downtown." Martha was glowing, talking about wedding plans, grandchildren. The setup was so obvious I could have predicted the punchline. But I sat quietly, fork halfway to my mouth, waiting for her to finish the performance. It got me thinking about Sylvia here. Mom's voice took on that tone I knew so well, the one that preceded her sharpest observations. She's accomplished so much in her career, really made something of herself. But at 37, she paused, letting the number hang in the air like an indictment. Dad cleared his throat, a gentle warning she ignored. "Well, I just wonder sometimes if she's been too focused on work, you know? Too picky, maybe. The good ones get taken early and now." She gestured vaguely in my direction, then chuckled, the sound light and casual and devastating. "At your age, who would even want you?" The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica stared at her plate. Nicholas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Dad's jaw tightened, and I could see him preparing to say something, to smooth over what couldn't be smoothed over. But I wasn't the same woman who used to absorb these comments without protest. 3 years of marriage had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. I'd learned what it meant to be truly seen, truly valued, truly loved. I'd learned what it felt like to be someone's first priority, their partner, their equal. I set my fork down carefully, the small clink of metal against china surprisingly loud in the tense quiet. When I looked up, Mom was still smiling, waiting for my reaction. She expected me to shrink, to deflect, to change the subject like I always did. Instead, I smiled back. Not the tight, polite smile I usually manage during these moments, but something genuine and calm and utterly confident. The smile of someone who held all the cards and was about to play the winning hand. My husband would disagree without assessment. The words came out steady and clear, carrying across the table like a declaration. Mom's smile faltered, confusion flickering across her features. What now? I maintained eye contact, my voice never wavering. My husband. He's a Navy SEAL commander. We just celebrated our 3rd anniversary last month. The effect was immediate and complete. Mom's fork slipped from her fingers, clattering against her plate with a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again without sound emerging. Around the table, the reaction was equally dramatic. Jessica's eyes went wide, her hand flying to cover her mouth. Nicholas leaned back in his chair as if the words had physical force. Dad's eyebrows shot up, and I could see him processing, recalculating everything he thought he knew about his daughter's life. But it was Mom's reaction that mattered most. For the first time in my adult life, she was completely speechless. The woman who always had a comment, always had an opinion, always had the last word, sat frozen in her chair, staring at me as if I'd announced I was an alien. The silence stretched on, thick with shock and recalculation. I took another bite of pie, savoring both the sweetness and the moment. After years of being misunderstood, dismissed, and pitted, I had their complete and undivided attention. Finally, Nicholas found his voice. "Sylvia, are you serious?" I nodded, still calm, still smiling. "Completely serious." "But how long have you been married?" Jessica whispered. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. The precision of my answer seemed to underscore the reality of it. This wasn't a fantasy or a desperate lie. This was fact, delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone I used in briefings. Mom finally managed to speak, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Why didn't you tell us?" I took my time answering, considering the question seriously. Why hadn't I told them? The reason seemed so clear to me, but looking at their shocked faces, I realized they genuinely didn't understand. Because I said finally, you never asked. To understand why that moment felt like such a victory, you'd have to know where I came from. Not geographically, we'd lived in the same small Ohio town my entire childhood, but emotionally. You'd have to understand the family dynamics that shaped me, the expectations that defined me, and the slow evolution that led me to choose silence over explanation. I was the middle child in a family that prized conventional success. My older brother Nicholas had followed the expected path: high school football, business degree, marriage to his college sweetheart, 2 kids, and a mortgage by 30. My younger sister Lisa had chosen the artistic route but made it palatable with marriage to a successful architect and a pottery studio that actually turned a profit. Then there was me, the anomaly. Even as a child, I'd been drawn to structure, to challenge, to proving myself in ways that made my family slightly uncomfortable. While other girls my age were playing house, I was reading military history, fascinated by strategy and leadership. My parents indulged what they assumed was a phase, buying me books about Joan of Arc and encouraging my interest in martial arts. But it wasn't a phase. By high school, I knew I wanted a military career. Not as a stepping stone to something else, not as a way to pay for college, but as a calling. I wanted to serve, to be part of something larger than myself, to test my limits in ways that civilian life couldn't offer. My family's reaction was complicated. They were proud in their way. Military service was respectable, honorable. But they also saw it as temporary, a detour before I settled into a more traditional life. Mom would introduce me to her friends as my daughter, the soldier, with the same tone she might have used to say my daughter, the phase. They expected me to outgrow it. Instead, I excelled at it. Basic training, advanced schools, deployments, promotions, each success only seemed to confirm their belief that I was avoiding real life rather than living it fully. They couldn't understand that the discipline, the challenge, the camaraderie of military life wasn't a substitute for something else. It was exactly what I wanted. The comments about my single status started in my late 20s, gentle at first. When you're ready to settle down, Mom would say, you'll find someone who appreciates how special you are. The implication was clear. My current life was preparation, not destination. By my early 30s, the gentleness had worn thin. Family gatherings became exercises in deflecting well-meaning advice about online dating, about lowering my standards, about the biological clock that everyone seemed to hear ticking except me. They meant well, but their concern felt like judgment. Their worry felt like disapproval. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't waiting for my life to begin. I was living it, fully and purposefully, in ways they couldn't see from their suburban vantage point. The deployments they saw as lonely isolation were experiences that connected me with people who shared my values and commitment. The demanding schedule they interpreted as workaholism was time spent in service to principles that gave my life meaning. And then I met Henry. It was during a joint training exercise, one of those multi-branch operations designed to improve coordination between services. He was Navy, I was Army, and under normal circumstances, our paths might never have crossed again. But these weren't normal circumstances. The exercise simulated a hostage rescue scenario, complex and dangerous enough to require the best from each service branch. I was leading my team through the urban warfare component when everything went sideways. Communication breakdown, equipment failure, civilian complications, the kind of chaos that separates good soldiers from great ones. Henry's SEAL team was supposed to provide overwatch, but when my team got pinned down by simulated enemy fire, he made a decision that wasn't in the playbook. Instead of maintaining his assigned position, he repositioned his team to create an escape route for mine. It was tactically sound but personally risky, the kind of split-second leadership that either gets you promoted or court-martialed. In this case, it saved the exercise and probably several careers. Afterward, during the debrief, I found myself studying him. Not romantically, at least, not initially, but professionally. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd been tested and proven, but without the arrogance that sometimes came with elite units. When he spoke about the tactical adjustment, he gave credit to his team, acknowledged the risks, and demonstrated the kind of analytical thinking that impressed even the most skeptical observers. We ended up in the same bar that night, part of a larger group but somehow gravitating toward each other in conversation. We talked about tactics and strategy, about leadership challenges, and the weight of responsibility. It was the kind of conversation I'd rarely had outside military circles, and never with someone who understood the pressures and rewards of high-stakes command positions. When he asked for my number, I gave it without hesitation. The relationship that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced. We understood each other's commitments, respected each other's dedication, and found ways to connect despite demanding schedules and frequent separations. There was no pressure to choose between career and relationship, no assumption that one had to diminish for the other to flourish. When he proposed, 18 months after that first meeting, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. We married in a simple ceremony at the base chapel, surrounded by military friends who understood that love and duty weren't competing forces, but complementary ones. I didn't tell my family about the engagement, the wedding, or the marriage that followed. Not out of spite, but out of exhaustion. I was tired of having to justify my choices, tired of defending my life, tired of being seen as incomplete simply because my path looked different from theirs. For 3 years, I lived a double life. At family gatherings, I was still the dedicated single daughter, the cautionary tale, the object of their loving but misguided concern. At home, I was a wife, a partner, part of a team that respected and challenged and supported each other. The deception wasn't malicious. It was protective. I was protecting my marriage from their scrutiny, my happiness from their opinions, my sense of self from their narrow definitions of success. But protection has its costs, and I was finally ready to pay them. The aftermath of that dinner revelation rippled through my family like a stone thrown into still water. In the days that followed, I watched as everyone scrambled to adjust their understanding of who I was and what my life actually looked like. Mom called the next morning, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Sylvia, we need to talk." I was in my kitchen, making coffee in the methodical way Henry had taught me, precise measurements, careful timing, attention to detail. The familiar routine grounded me as I listened to her struggle with words that felt foreign in her mouth. "I don't understand why you felt you couldn't tell us," she said finally. "Are you ashamed of us? Of your family?" The question revealed everything about how she saw the situation. In her mind, my silence was about them, about some failing on their part that had driven me to secrecy. She couldn't conceive that it might be about me, about protecting something precious from their casual cruelty disguised as concern. "It's not about shame, Mom." "Then what is it about?" I poured my coffee, watching the steam rise in the morning light streaming through my windows. How do you explain to someone that their love felt like suffocation? That their concern felt like judgment? That their assumptions about your life had become so entrenched that the truth seemed impossible to introduce? "It's about being seen," I said finally. "Really seen, for who I am, not who you think I should be." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller, more uncertain than I'd ever heard it. "I see you, Sylvia. You're my daughter. I've always seen you." But that was exactly the problem. She saw daughter, not woman. She saw her version of my story, not the story I was actually living. She saw absence where there was presence, failure where there was simply privacy. Nicholas called that afternoon, his approach more direct. "Jesus, Sylvia, a Navy SEAL? How did we miss that?" His tone carried a mixture of embarrassment and genuine confusion. As a successful businessman, he was used to reading people, to picking up on subtle cues that revealed important information. The fact that I'd kept something this significant hidden for 3 years challenged his sense of himself as observant, intuitive. "You didn't miss anything," I told him. "You just didn't ask the right questions." But 3 years, Sylvia. 3 years of marriage, and we had no idea. That's not normal. Normal. There was that word again, the measuring stick my family used to evaluate every choice, every deviation from their expected path. Normal was Nicholas's suburban life, Jessica's book club, Lisa's pottery studio. Normal was what they understood, what they could categorize and approve. "Maybe normal isn't the goal," I said. Jessica was the most hurt, I think. She called that evening, her voice thick with tears. "I thought we were friends, Sylvia. I thought you trusted me." Of all the reactions, hers was the hardest to bear. Jessica had always been kind to me, including me in sister-in-law activities without the obligation that blood relationships sometimes carried. She'd never participated in Mom's casual cruelty, never added her voice to the chorus of concern about my single status. "I do trust you, Jess. Then why didn't you tell me? I would have been happy for you. I would have wanted to celebrate with you." And that was true. She would have been happy, would have wanted details about the wedding, about Henry, about our life together. But she also would have told Nicholas, who would have told Mom, and the secret would have become family property, subject to analysis and opinion and the kind of loving interference that my family mistook for support. "I needed it to be mine," I said finally. "Just mine, for a while." Dad's reaction was the most complex. He didn't call immediately like the others. Instead, he showed up at my door 3 days later, holding a bottle of wine and wearing the expression he'd used when I was a child and had done something that required serious discussion. "Can we talk?" he asked. We sat in my living room, the space I'd carefully curated to reflect the life I'd built with Henry. Military commendations on the walls alongside photographs from our travels. Books on strategy and leadership sharing shelf space with novels we'd read together. Evidence of a full, rich life that my family had never bothered to notice. Dad looked around, taking it in with the same methodical attention he'd once used to examine my report cards. "Nice place," he said finally. "Thank you. Your husband, Henry? He's really a SEAL commander. I nodded. And you've been married 3 years. Another nod. He was quiet for a long time, processing information that didn't fit with his understanding of his daughter's life. Finally, he looked at me with something that might have been admiration. You know, I always knew you were tough. From the time you were little, you had this determination, this strength that impressed me. But I guess I didn't realize how strong. Strong enough to live my own life, you mean? Strong enough to protect it, he said. From us. It was the closest anyone in my family had come to understanding. Dad saw what the others couldn't, that my silence hadn't been about shame or spite, but about preservation. I'd been protecting something valuable from people who'd proven they couldn't handle it with care. I'm sorry, he said quietly. For not seeing. For not asking better questions. For letting your mother's concerns become the family narrative about your life. The apology meant more than he probably realized. Not because it absolved anyone, but because it acknowledged something that had been missing from our family dynamic for years. Respect for my autonomy, for my ability to make decisions about my own life. But apologies, however sincere, couldn't undo years of casual dismissal. They couldn't erase the comments, the assumptions, the well-meaning interference that had driven me to secrecy in the first place. Forgiveness was possible, but trust would have to be rebuilt slowly, carefully, with new ground rules that protected what I'd learned to value most. The hardest part wasn't their hurt feelings or confused questions. It was the realization that I'd spent so much energy hiding from people who were supposed to know me best. The woman who could navigate complex military operations with calm precision had been afraid to tell her own family about the most important relationship in her life. That said something about them, but it also said something about me. Something I was only beginning to understand and didn't entirely like. I'd let their limited vision of my life become more powerful than my own reality. I'd given them authority they'd never actually earned. It was time to take that authority back. The decision to maintain my boundaries wasn't born from anger, though anger had certainly played a role in bringing me to this point. It came from something deeper. A recognition that relationships require mutual respect to function, and respect had been notably absent from my family's treatment of me for years. I wasn't interested in dramatic confrontations or emotional speeches about how they'd failed me. Military life had taught me that sustainable change comes through consistent action, not grand gestures. So instead of explaining everything they'd done wrong, I simply started doing things differently. When Mom called with her half-hearted apology, "I'm sorry if what I said hurt your feelings, but you have to understand, I was worried about you," I listened politely and then redirected the conversation to safer topics. Weather, current events, anything that didn't require me to accept responsibility for her discomfort with the truth. But Sylvia, we need to talk about this. I need to understand why you felt you couldn't trust us. There's nothing to understand, Mom. I made a choice about my privacy. You're entitled to your feelings about that choice, but I'm not responsible for managing them. The line went quiet. In our family's established dynamic, I was supposed to soothe, to explain, to take responsibility for everyone else's emotional reactions. The fact that I wasn't playing that role anymore left her without a script. Nicholas tried a different approach, appealing to what he assumed was my sense of obligation. Look, Sylvia, I get that you wanted privacy. But family means something. It means being included, being trusted with important information. Mom's really hurt, and I think you owe her an explanation. I don't owe anyone an explanation for how I choose to live my life. That's pretty cold, even for you. The comment revealed more than he probably intended. Even for you. As if coldness was a character trait they'd already assigned to me, another way of explaining why my life didn't match their expectations. The dedicated daughter was cold. The single woman was emotionally unavailable. The soldier was too hard, too distant, too masculine for love. None of it was true, but it was easier for them to blame my personality than to examine their own assumptions. Jessica tried the emotional approach, tears in her voice as she pleaded for understanding. I just want us to be close, Sylvia. Real sisters. But how can we be close if you don't trust me with the important things in your life? Closeness isn't about sharing every detail, Jess. It's about respect. About accepting that people get to decide what they share and when they share it. But your wedding, Sylvia. You got married and didn't invite us. That's not about privacy. That's about shutting us out. She wasn't wrong, exactly. The wedding had been small, private, limited to military friends who understood our world and our choices. But the decision to exclude family hadn't been about punishment. It had been about protection, protecting a sacred moment from becoming another opportunity for their opinions and interference. My wedding was about Henry and me, not about managing everyone else's expectations or feelings. That's selfish. Maybe it was. But after years of putting everyone else's comfort before my own truth, a little selfishness felt revolutionary. Dad was the only one who didn't push for explanations or apologies. Instead, he asked a different question: what would you need from us to feel comfortable sharing more? The question surprised me with its directness and its implicit acknowledgement that the problem wasn't my secretiveness, but their trustworthiness. It suggested he understood, at least partially, that my silence had been protective rather than punitive. Respect, I said without hesitation. Respect for my choices, my timeline, my right to live my life without constant commentary or advice I didn't ask for. And if we can't do that, then we'll have a polite but distant relationship. Sunday dinners when schedules permit. Holiday cards. Surface-level conversations about work and weather. It wasn't a threat. It was simply a statement of fact. I'd spent too many years accepting treatment I wouldn't tolerate from strangers, simply because we shared DNA. Blood relationship wasn't a license for disrespect, and I was no longer willing to pretend otherwise. The hardest part was watching them struggle to adjust. Mom, in particular, seemed lost without her role as the family authority on my life. She'd spent years diagnosing my problems and prescribing solutions. Suddenly, she had no problems to solve, no advice to give, no corrections to make. At the next family gathering, she tried to revert to old patterns. Sylvia, you look tired. Are you getting enough sleep? Military life can be so demanding, especially for someone you're, I'm fine, Mom. My voice was pleasant but firm. Thank you for asking. She blinked, clearly expecting more. An explanation of my sleep schedule, details about work stress, something she could analyze and improve. When none came, she looked uncertain, like an actor who'd forgotten her lines. Nicholas jumped in, trying to fill the awkward silence. So, where's this husband of yours? When do we get to meet him? When it feels right. And when will that be? I'll let you know. Again, the response was polite but offered no opening for negotiation or pressure. I wasn't being cruel, but I also wasn't being accommodating in the way they'd come to expect. Lisa, who'd been mostly quiet during the family drama, finally spoke up. You've changed, Sylvia. Yes, I have. I'm not sure I like it. That's okay. You don't have to. The conversation moved on to safer topics after that, but the underlying tension remained. They were all walking on eggshells, afraid to say the wrong thing, uncertain how to interact with this version of me who wouldn't absorb their casual cruelty or manage their emotional reactions. It wasn't comfortable for any of us, but comfort had never been the goal. Respect was the goal. Authentic relationship was the goal. And if that required a period of discomfort while everyone adjusted to new boundaries, so be it. I'd spent 3 years protecting my marriage from their opinions. Now I was protecting myself from their expectations. It was long overdue. Mom's adjustment period was the most difficult to watch, though I found myself less sympathetic than I might have expected. For so many years, she'd held court as the family expert on my life, diagnosing my problems and prescribing solutions with the confidence of someone who'd never actually listened to what I was saying. Now, stripped of that role, she seemed genuinely lost. At family gatherings, I could see her watching me, searching for openings to reassert her authority. When I mentioned being tired after a particularly demanding week, she'd start to launch into advice about work-life balance, then catch herself mid-sentence, uncertainty flickering across her features. When I declined a second helping of dinner, she'd begin to comment on my weight, my eating habits, my need to take better care of myself, then trail off when she met my steady gaze. It was like watching someone try to perform a familiar dance with a partner who'd changed all the steps. I don't know how to talk to you anymore, she confessed during one of our phone conversations, her voice carrying a mixture of frustration and genuine confusion. Try talking to me like you'd talk to any other adult woman whose life choices you respect." The silence that followed was telling. She'd never talked to me that way because she'd never seen me that way. Even as I'd advanced in my career, proven my competence in dozens of challenging situations, and built a life that worked for me, she'd continued to see me as the daughter who needed guidance, correction, improvement. "But you're my daughter," she said finally, as if that explained everything. "Yes, but I'm also a 37-year-old woman with her own life, her own marriage, her own ability to make decisions. Being your daughter doesn't negate those other things. I was just trying to help." It was the defense she always used, the shield that was supposed to protect her from accountability for the impact of her words. She was trying to help. She was worried about me. She was looking out for my best interests. As if good intentions could justify years of casual dismissal and condescending advice. "I know you thought you were helping," I said carefully. "But helping would have involved asking what I needed instead of assuming you knew. It would have involved listening to what I was actually saying about my life instead of imposing your interpretation on it." I did listen. "No, Mom. You waited for your turn to speak. That's not the same thing." The conversation ended awkwardly, as most of our conversations did these days. She hung up frustrated, and I was left feeling both vindicated and exhausted. Standing up for yourself was supposed to feel empowering, and in many ways it did. But it was also emotionally draining, requiring constant vigilance and energy I'd rather spend elsewhere. My siblings were dealing with their own versions of adjustment. Nicholas had always seen himself as the protective older brother, the one who looked out for his sisters and offered advice when needed. Learning that I'd been married for 3 years without his knowledge, that I'd navigated major life decisions without his input, challenged his sense of his own importance in my life. "I feel like I don't even know you," he said during one of our increasingly rare phone calls. "That's probably true," I agreed. "But that's not my fault. I've been here all along. You just weren't paying attention to who I actually was." "That's not fair, Sylvia. We're family. We care about you." Caring about someone means seeing them clearly, not projecting your own assumptions onto them. It means respecting their autonomy even when their choices don't match your expectations. He struggled with that, I could tell. In his world, family meant involvement, input, shared decision-making. The idea that I might want to make major life choices without consulting him, without benefiting from his perspective, didn't compute. Jessica's reaction was perhaps the most painful because it was the most personal. She genuinely thought we were close, and my revelation had forced her to confront the fact that our relationship had been more one-sided than she'd realized. "I told you everything," she said during one of our increasingly strained conversations. My problems with Nicholas, my worries about the kids, my struggles with work. "I trusted you with all of it. And I listened. I supported you. I never judged you or offered unsolicited advice about how you should handle things differently. But you didn't trust me back. I trusted you with what felt safe to share. Just like you probably don't tell me every detail of your marriage or your private thoughts. Trust isn't about complete disclosure. It's about feeling safe to be vulnerable. And you didn't feel safe with us." It wasn't a question, and I could hear the hurt in her voice. But I also heard something else, understanding. Jessica was beginning to grasp that my silence hadn't been about her personally, but about the family dynamic that made honesty feel dangerous. "I didn't feel safe being fully myself," I corrected. "There's a difference. The changes weren't just affecting how my family saw me, they were changing how I saw myself. For years, I'd compartmentalized my life, keeping my family relationships separate from my real life in a way that had required enormous energy and careful management. I'd been 2 different people, the dutiful daughter who absorbed criticism and advice, and the competent officer who commanded respect and operated with confidence. Now, for the first time, I was trying to be one person in both contexts. It was liberating, but also uncomfortable. The daughter who'd learned to make herself small was having to learn how to take up space. The woman who'd protected her truth by hiding it was having to learn how to defend it openly. Henry noticed the change immediately when I came home from family dinners. Instead of being drained and frustrated, I was energized, even when the conversations had been difficult. "You're different," he observed after one particularly tense Sunday dinner. "How so?" "More yourself. Like, you don't have to shrink anymore. He was right. I'd been shrinking for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand at full height, to speak with my natural voice, to take up the space I'd earned. Learning to do it with my family was harder than doing it anywhere else, but it was also more necessary. Because if I couldn't be myself with the people who were supposed to know me best, then what was the point of any of it? The attempts at reconciliation came in waves, each family member approaching the problem with their own style and timeline. But reconciliation required acknowledgement of what had gone wrong, and that proved more challenging than anyone expected. Mom's first attempt came through food, naturally. She called to invite me for lunch, just the two of us, so we can really talk. Her voice carried that careful tone she used when she was trying to manage a situation, and I could practically hear her rehearsing the conversation in her head. We met at a restaurant she'd chosen, a quiet place with white tablecloths and low lighting that she probably thought would encourage intimate conversation. She ordered for both of us without asking what I wanted, a habit so ingrained she didn't even seem to notice she was doing it. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, cutting her chicken salad into precise squares. "About respect and seeing you clearly. I want you to know that I do see you, Sylvia. I've always been proud of you." It was a start, but it missed the point entirely. Pride wasn't the same as respect. Being proud of someone suggested ownership, reflected glory that enhanced your own image. Respecting someone meant accepting their autonomy even when it made you uncomfortable. "What do you see when you look at me, Mom?" She seemed surprised by the question. "I see my daughter. My accomplished, dedicated daughter who's maybe been too focused on work to make room for other things in her life. Even now, even after everything, she couldn't let go of her narrative. I was accomplished, yes, but only in ways that fit her definition of accomplishment. I was dedicated, but to the wrong things. I was focused on work because I hadn't made room for the things she thought should be more important. What if I told you that I'm happy?" I asked. "That my life is exactly what I want it to be? Are you happy?" The fact that she had to ask told me everything I needed to know. She'd been so busy worrying about what was missing from my life that she'd never considered I might be content with what was there. "Yes, Mom. I'm very happy." She looked genuinely puzzled by this information, as if happiness were incompatible with the life she'd imagined I was living. "But you're so isolated, so disconnected from family. How can that make you happy?" "I'm not isolated. I'm selective. There's a difference." The lunch continued along similar lines, with Mom offering variations of the same theme. She was sorry I'd felt hurt, but she'd only been trying to help, and couldn't I see that her concern came from love? She never quite managed to apologize for the actual behavior, only for my reaction to it. Nicholas's approach was more direct, but equally problematic. He showed up at my office unannounced, using his business connections to get past security with the kind of confidence that assumed his presence would be welcome. "We need to clear the air," he announced, settling into the chair across from my desk as if he'd been invited. I finished the report I was reviewing before looking up, letting the silence stretch until he shifted uncomfortably. "What can I help you with, Nicholas?" "This thing with the family. It's gotten out of hand. Mom's upset, Jessica's confused, and frankly, I think you're being stubborn just to prove a point." "What point is that?" "That you don't need us. That you're better than us." "I get it, Sylvia. You've made something of yourself, and that's great. But family is family. You can't just shut us out because we didn't handle things perfectly." The conversation revealed everything about how he saw the situation. In his mind, this was about my ego, my need to prove superiority, my inability to forgive minor imperfections. He couldn't conceive that it might be about something more fundamental, the right to be seen accurately and treated with respect. "I haven't shut anyone out," I said calmly. "I've simply established boundaries around how I'm willing to be treated." "By keeping your marriage secret for 3 years? By protecting something important from people who'd proven they couldn't handle it with care?" He didn't like that answer. I could see him struggling with the implication that he and the rest of the family had been untrustworthy, that their treatment of me had been careless enough to require protection. "That's not fair, Sylvia. We would have been happy for you." "Would you? Or would you have had opinions about my choice of husband, my decision to have a small wedding, my timing, my dress, my honeymoon plans?" Would you have respected my decisions, or would you have treated them as starting points for discussion and improvement? The silence that followed was answer enough. Nicholas knew, as I did, that my marriage would have become family property, subject to analysis and advice, and the kind of loving interference that my family mistook for support. Jessica's attempt was the most genuine, though it too fell short of what was needed. She asked if we could have coffee, and when we met, she came prepared with a list of questions written on a small notebook, as if she were conducting an interview. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, "about trust and feeling safe. And I realized that maybe I don't know how to be a good sister-in-law to someone like you. Someone like me? Someone so private, so self-contained. I'm used to sharing everything, talking through every problem, asking for advice. But you're different, and I never learned how to respect that difference." It was closer to understanding than anyone else had managed, an acknowledgement that the problem wasn't my secretiveness, but their inability to accept my communication style. "I don't need you to change how you are, Jess. I just need you to accept how I am. But how do I show I care if you won't let me help?" The question revealed the core misunderstanding. In her mind, caring required action, involvement, the kind of active participation that I'd always experienced as interference. She couldn't conceive of caring that was simply present, available without being pushy. "You show you care by respecting my boundaries, by trusting that I can handle my own life, by celebrating my choices even when they're different from what you would choose." She made notes as I spoke, and I could see her genuinely trying to process information that challenged her assumptions about relationships. Of all my family members, she seemed most capable of real change. Dad's approach was characteristically patient and thoughtful. He didn't demand conversations or dramatic reconciliations. Instead, he simply adjusted his behavior, speaking to me with the same respect he showed other adults, asking questions without assuming he knew the answers. "How long have you been stationed at your current base?" he asked during one family dinner. Not, "When will you transfer to something closer to home?" or "Isn't it time you considered a position with more regular hours?" Just genuine curiosity about my current situation. 2 years. It's a good assignment. What do you like about it? Again, a real question seeking real information, not a setup for advice or criticism. I found myself sharing more than I had in years, talking about the challenges and rewards of my position, the satisfaction of working with highly motivated people, the sense of purpose that came from meaningful work. The conversation felt different because it was built on respect rather than judgment. Dad wasn't trying to fix anything or improve anything. He was simply getting to know his daughter as she actually was. It was a start. Not enough to repair years of damage, but enough to suggest that repair might be possible with time, patience, and genuine commitment to change. But change, I was learning, was harder than anyone wanted to admit. And some people were more capable of it than others. 3 years have passed since that dinner table revelation, and the landscape of my family relationships has settled into something neither completely healed nor entirely broken. It's more honest than it used to be, which makes it both more difficult and more authentic. Mom and I have found an equilibrium that works for both of us, though it's not the relationship either of us originally wanted. She's learned to catch herself before offering unsolicited advice, and I've learned to appreciate the effort that self-restraint requires. Our conversations are shorter now, more careful, but also more genuine. When she asks how I'm doing, I can tell she's actually listening to the answer instead of waiting for her turn to speak. The change became most apparent during my recent promotion ceremony. Mom attended, sitting in the audience as I received my new rank, and afterward, instead of immediately launching into suggestions about what this might mean for my future, she simply said, "I'm proud of you, Sylvia." No qualifiers. No additional commentary about what I should do next or how this opportunity might finally allow me to consider other priorities. Just acknowledgement of an achievement that belonged entirely to me. It was a small moment, but it represented enormous progress. She was learning to see my successes as mine rather than as opportunities for her input. Nicholas has struggled more with the adjustment. His identity as the protective older brother doesn't adapt easily to a sister who neither needs nor wants his protection. Our relationship remains cordial but distant, built on shared history rather than current connection. He asks about Henry now, includes him in family invitations, makes appropriate comments about marriage and partnership. But there's still an undertone of bewilderment, as if he can't quite figure out how I managed to build a life he didn't know about. At family gatherings, he'll sometimes catch himself starting to offer advice about my career or my choices, then stop mid-sentence with a rueful smile. Sorry, Sylvia. Old habits. It's more awareness than I used to get, which feels like progress even if it's incomplete progress. Jessica has surprised me by becoming the family member who's adapted most successfully to these new dynamics. She's learned to ask permission before offering advice, to express interest without demanding details, to support without intruding. Our relationship has become more balanced, less one-sided, built on mutual respect rather than assumed intimacy. When I finally introduced Henry to the family at a Christmas gathering 2 years ago, Jessica was the one who made the effort to draw him into conversation without overwhelming him with questions or expectations. She treated him like a person rather than like a prize I'd finally managed to acquire, which allowed him to relax and be himself. Henry's integration into my family has been its own education for all of us. They expected someone intimidating, I think, someone whose military bearing and elite training would make him difficult to relate to. Instead, they found a man who's quietly confident, genuinely interested in others, and secure enough in himself to handle their curiosity with grace. At that first Christmas dinner, Mom tried to impress him with elaborate cooking and formal table settings, the kind of performance she put on for important guests. Henry complimented the food genuinely, but also helped clear dishes, asked about family traditions, and told stories that made everyone laugh. By the end of the evening, he'd become simply another person at the table rather than the mysterious figure they'd built up in their imaginations. He's not what I expected, Mom confessed to me later. What did you expect? Someone harder. More military. It was a telling comment, revealing how she'd categorized both Henry and me in ways that didn't match reality. Military service, in her mind, required a kind of hardness that was incompatible with warmth, humor, or genuine connection. The fact that Henry could be both a SEAL commander and someone who genuinely enjoyed hearing Dad's stories about his garden challenged assumptions she didn't even realize she'd been making. Dad, characteristically, had the most natural reaction to Henry's presence. He treated him like he treated any son-in-law, with polite interest, respectful questions, and the kind of casual acceptance that made integration easy. When Henry mentioned his interest in woodworking, Dad immediately began planning projects they could work on together. It was the kind of organic connection that happens when people see each other clearly instead of through the filter of expectations and assumptions. The changes in my family dynamics have changed me too, in ways I'm still discovering. For years, I'd been two different people, the competent professional who commanded respect in military settings, and the diminished daughter who absorbed criticism and advice in family settings. Learning to be consistently myself in all contexts has been liberating, but also challenging. I've had to learn that standing up for myself doesn't require being defensive or aggressive. It simply requires being clear about my boundaries and consistent in maintaining them. When Mom slips back into old patterns of offering unsolicited advice, I can redirect the conversation without anger. When Nicholas starts to offer solutions to problems I haven't asked for help with, I can politely decline without feeling guilty. Most importantly, I've learned that authentic relationships require courage from everyone involved. It takes courage to see people as they actually are rather than as you want them to be. It takes courage to accept that your perspective might be incomplete or inaccurate. It takes courage to change patterns that have been established for years. My marriage remains strong, built on the foundation of mutual respect and understanding that attracted us to each other in the first place. Henry has been patient with my family's adjustment period, supportive during the difficult conversations, and proud of the boundaries I've learned to maintain. He's never asked me to choose between him and them, understanding that healthy relationships don't require such choices. The lesson of these last few years isn't about proving someone wrong or winning some kind of family power struggle. It's about the revolutionary act of insisting on being seen clearly, of refusing to accept treatment that diminishes your worth, of protecting what's precious to you even when that protection disappoints others. My mother's comment that night, "At your age, who would even want you?" revealed more about her limitations than mine. But my response revealed something about me. I was finally ready to stop accepting her version of my story and start living by my own truth. That's not revenge. That's simply the quiet dignity of a woman who knows her own worth and refuses to negotiate it away for the comfort of others. Some battles are won not through dramatic confrontation, but through the steady courage of refusing to shrink, of standing at your full height and letting others adjust to the space you've always deserved to occupy. The fork may have slipped from her hand, but I never dropped my composure. And that, perhaps, made all the difference. 2 months after Henry's first Christmas with my family, I got the call that changes everything for military families. Deployment orders. 6 months in a classified location, doing work I couldn't discuss, leaving behind the life I'd fought so hard to protect and define. I'd been through deployments before, but this one felt different. For the first time, I had a family dynamic worth preserving, relationships that were finally moving in a healthier direction. The timing felt cruel, like the universe was testing whether the progress we'd made was substantial enough to survive separation and uncertainty. Henry took the news with the calm professionalism I'd come to expect from him. "When do you leave?" 3 weeks. He nodded, already shifting into the mental framework that military spouses develop, calculating logistics, preparing for single life, adjusting expectations for communication and connection. It wasn't his first deployment as a military husband, and it wouldn't be his last. "Your family?" That was the question I'd been dreading. After years of keeping them at arm's length, I'd finally allowed them closer, let them see pieces of my real life. Now I'd be disappearing again, unable to explain where or why or for how long, leaving them with nothing but silence and worry. I'll have to tell them something. What will you tell them? I'd been thinking about that since the orders arrived. In the past, I'd simply mentioned that I'd be away for a while, letting them assume it was training or a temporary assignment. But those casual deceptions belonged to the old version of our relationship, when distance and mystery served as protection. Now, after demanding honesty and respect from them, I owed them something closer to truth. The conversation with my family happened over Sunday dinner, which had become a monthly tradition since Henry's integration into our routine. He was there when I made the announcement, his presence a steadying force as I navigated waters that felt suddenly treacherous. "I'm being deployed," I said during a pause in conversation about Lisa's latest pottery exhibition. The words fell into the comfortable family chatter like stones into still water. Mom's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Nicholas's eyebrows went up. Jessica leaned forward with immediate concern. "Deployed where?" Dad asked, his voice carrying the careful tone he used when he sensed important information was coming. "I can't tell you that." The silence that followed was different from the shocked silence that had greeted my marriage announcement. This was heavier, laden with implications they were only beginning to understand. "What do you mean, you can't tell us?" Mom's voice was tight with the fear she was trying to control. "I mean the location and nature of my assignment are classified. I can't discuss them." "But we're your family." The words came out sharper than she probably intended, revealing the panic underneath her carefully maintained composure. "Yes, and I'm telling you what I can tell you. I'll be gone for approximately 6 months. I'll have limited communication availability. Henry will be my emergency contact and point of information if needed." Nicholas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Sylvia, this is serious. If something happens to you, if there's an emergency, we need to know how to reach you. The military has protocols for family notification. Henry knows how to access those systems if necessary." I could see them struggling with the limitations I was placing on their involvement, their right to information, their ability to worry productively. For people who'd spent years believing they had insight into my life, the reminder of how much they didn't and couldn't know was jarring. Jessica spoke quietly, her voice careful. "Are you going somewhere dangerous?" It was the question they all wanted to ask, but were afraid to voice. The question that revealed their growing understanding of what military service actually meant, what I'd been doing all these years while they worried about my social life and relationship status. "All deployments involve some level of risk. That's the nature of military service." That's not an answer, Nicholas said. It's the only answer I can give you. Henry reached under the table and squeezed my hand, a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by the rest of the family. He understood the position I was in, caught between operational security requirements and family expectations, trying to balance my professional obligations with these newly delicate relationships. When do you leave? Dad asked. 2 weeks and 3 days. The precision of my answer underscored the reality of military timing: exact, inflexible, non-negotiable. This wasn't a business trip that could be adjusted for family convenience. This was service, duty. The commitment they were finally beginning to understand had shaped my entire adult life. The rest of the dinner passed in subdued conversation, everyone processing what this deployment meant for our carefully reconstructed family dynamic. They were learning, in real time, what it meant to love someone whose life involved classified missions and uncertain communication schedules. After dinner, Mom pulled me aside, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I'm scared for you. It was the most honest thing she'd said to me in years. No advice, no suggestions for how I should handle things differently, no attempts to manage or improve the situation. Just raw, genuine fear for her daughter's safety. I know, Mom. That's natural. I don't know how to do this. How to worry about you properly when I don't know what I'm worrying about. You do it the same way military families have always done it. One day at a time. Trust that I'm well-trained, well-prepared, and surrounded by people who are equally committed to the mission and to each other. She nodded, but I could see her struggling with the helplessness that came with loving someone whose work took them into spaces you couldn't follow or fully understand. Will you write? Email? Something. When I can. But you need to understand that communication will be limited and irregular. That's not personal. That's operational reality. The weeks before departure were filled with the familiar rituals of pre-deployment preparation. Equipment checks, briefings, medical updates, legal documents. But they were also filled with something new: family members who were genuinely trying to support me in ways they didn't fully understand. Jessica researched military deployment support resources, finding websites and books designed to help families cope with separation and uncertainty. She didn't offer advice or suggestions. She simply shared information and let me decide what was useful. Nicholas, in his typically practical way, focused on logistics. If Henry needs anything while you're gone, if there are emergencies or situations we can help with, you make sure he knows he can call us. It was his way of acknowledging that Henry was now family too, that our marriage created connections and obligations that extended beyond just the two of us. Dad approached it characteristically. I'm proud of you, he said simply during one of our last conversations before departure. I don't fully understand what you do or why it requires so much secrecy, but I'm proud that you do it well. The deployment itself unfolded as deployments do, long stretches of routine punctuated by moments of intensity, limited communication complicated by time zones and operational requirements. The strange intimacy of working closely with people who become temporary family in hostile environments. But something was different this time. The emails I received from home weren't filled with complaints about my absence or demands for more frequent contact. Instead, they carried updates about daily life, expressions of support, and the kind of patient love that doesn't require constant reassurance. Mom's emails were short but consistent, sharing small news about neighbors and weather and family happenings without expecting immediate responses. Jessica sent care packages that arrived through military mail channels she'd researched and navigated herself. Nicholas forwarded articles he thought I might find interesting, never asking for my opinions or reactions. Henry's communications were steady and sustaining, but he also shared news from my family, keeping me connected to the relationships I'd worked so hard to rebuild. Your mom called to check on me, he'd write. She wanted to make sure I was eating properly. I think she's adopting me. The deployment became a test not just of my professional skills, but of whether the changes in my family relationships were substantial enough to survive stress, uncertainty, and enforced distance. Whether the respect and boundaries we'd established could hold when fear and love collided with operational security and military necessity. 6 months later, when I returned home, I found relationships that had not only survived but deepened. My family had learned something crucial: That loving someone in the military means accepting limitations you can't control, trusting competence you can't fully see, and supporting choices you don't completely understand. The deployment had taught them what I'd been trying to tell them for years, that my life was bigger than they'd imagined, more complex than they'd assumed, and worthy of respect even when it remained mysterious to them. Sometimes the strongest relationships are forged not in moments of perfect understanding, but in the willingness to love across the spaces understanding cannot reach. And that's how one dinner table comment turned into the moment I finally stood my ground. My life didn't change overnight, but the way my family saw me did. What about you? Have you ever had to set boundaries with family after years of being underestimated? How did they react? Did they change or stay the same? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if this story hit home, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more true stories about respect, resilience, and reclaiming your worth.